This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Today, I would like to show you a simple method for building medieval fantasy European style architecture completely from scratch using no advanced tools or supplies for games like Mordheim, Dungeons & Dragons, or Warhammer. We're going to start by building a sort of ruined stone foundation for a building, and in a future video, I hope to build a sort of second floor that goes on top of it that will turn this into a fully restored, intact type of building. For building the floor and the foundation of this building, we're going to use what in Canada is called foam core. I just buy this at the dollar store for like $2 a sheet, so it's a pretty cheap and versatile building material. And specifically, if you can find it, I'm going to recommend using the black colored foam core. As you're going to see at a later step, that will make painting this model much easier. So to start out, we're going to cut out a roughly L-shaped piece for our initial floor. And for this, I'm just using an X-Acto knife on a cutting mat. Real basic stuff here. You don't even need to peel off the paper or anything. You can build your piece of architecture in whatever shape you want. I've chosen an L shape, but you just do whatever you want. Once you have the shape you want, we can start paneling the floor using lumber. And by lumber, I mean coffee stir sticks. I think these things work really great for miniature scale lumber. They're super cheap and easy to find. I bought like 1,000 of them for $10 on Amazon. And like all of the supplies in this video, I've put an Amazon affiliate link down in the description. As always, buy local if you can, but if you just want a reference to what I'm talking about, or if you're gonna buy it on Amazon anyway, there's a link down in the description. I glued all of these sticks down using a thick layer of Mod Podge, which is sort of a PVA glue / primer type of thing. And this is my first mistake. I do not recommend doing what I'm doing on the screen right now. By doing this, I actually ended up warping the board quite a lot by using this much Mod Podge, so I recommend using just tacky or PVA glue and not putting down this thick of a layer. This is totally unnecessary. Don't do what I'm doing here, just use PVA glue, okay? So anyway, we're just gonna glue down the sticks in a sort of random pattern. I try and make it so that the ends of each board don't directly line up with each other to create some visual variety and none of these like tangents. It took a long time to glue all these down, but it looks super satisfying at the end. After gluing it down and waiting a few hours, you can see it's totally warped again. Don't use as much glue or Mod Podge as I did. But thankfully, you can easily fix this using a technique from Wyloch over at Wyloch's Armory. Link down in the description to his channel. I don't remember the specific video that he mentioned this, but his solution to this sort of thing is to just put a second coat of PVA glue, or in our case, we're using Mod Podge, on the opposite side of the floor panel. And once we let that dry, it should help it warp back the opposite way. And after leaving this overnight to warp back the other way, it has unfortunately warped too far back the other way, so darn it. But don't worry, I have an idea to fix this. But before we implement that idea, we're going to need to cut off all of the excess wood panels with some little wire cutters. Again, you can get these for super cheap at a place like Amazon or maybe in a craft store. These are the same clippers that I use for clipping miniatures off of sprues. And once this was done, I just cut off a little bit of the extra foam on one of the sides that was a little bit uneven. And once we trim away this little extra piece of foam, we have our perfectly nice, only slightly warped floor. Like I said, I do have a solution to this, so here's what we're going to do. I cut out a bunch of 1-inch strips of foam core to create a sort of raised platform for the floor to sit on top of. I figured this is more realistic anyway, and by gluing these on with hot glue and getting a really solid connection, we can sort of unwarp the floor slightly by taking advantage of these right angles. And once this was done, I think it really helped a lot to make the floor slightly less warped, but also it just looks cooler having it a little bit elevated like this. But also you might be thinking, well, this doesn't really look like a medieval house. Wouldn't there be like bricks or something? Yeah, you're right. Let's build some bricks. Step 1, peel the paper off the foam core. There are a lot of ways to do this, but personally, a knife and a lot of patience works just fine for me. I cut the foam core down into smaller pieces and then peel off the paper at the edges. Step 2, cut the foam core into strips. At this step, we can also remove any extra little bits of paper that are still clinging to the foam core. Step 3, cut the strips into bricks. Step 4, put your bricks into a sturdy container with some rocks and shake them up vigorously. This will help round them all out and make them look like actual bricks. Once we have a ton of bricks, we can then lay them down one by one by one by one by one by one by one to create a solid stone foundation. You can use any sort of glue you want for this, except for don't use super glue as that will melt your foam, but anything like PVA glue, tacky glue, or hot glue should work just fine. Personally, I've taken a tip from the excellent terrain building channel Doves and Dice here. I've been watching a lot of his videos lately, super cool channel, and decided to use a combination of hot glue and PVA glue, not mixing the two together. That's not what I'm talking about. What he recommends is that you use hot glue to lay down your first layer of bricks to create a stronger foundation. And then for each additional layer of bricks, you can use tacky glue or PVA glue. I'm using tacky glue here. If you're not familiar, tacky glue is just a type of PVA glue, I think, that dries faster. Laying down these bricks one by one by one by one takes a very, very long time, but I think the results are worth it compared to other methods of making miniature stone walls. And because this is going to take a really, really long time for me to lay down all of these bricks, I think this is an ideal time to tell you about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that I've been using for just a little bit over a decade now for all of my website needs. It's super easy to use and much, much less tedious than cutting out and gluing on hundreds of bricks to a tiny house by hand. You just pick from one of their fabulously designed pre-made templates or build a brand new custom template from scratch using their revolutionary new tool, Squarespace Blueprints. No coding, technical knowledge, or foam bricks required. I've been using my Squarespace website to host a gallery of my painted miniatures, all of my painting reference documents, as well as my online store, which has been super easy to set up, add new products to whenever I want to, and apparently supports a number of different payment options. So if you need a website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/StayInAHowl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. That was a lot of bricks. And with our stone foundation complete, it's time to move on to building the building's walls. On the ground floor, I eventually want a mixture of stone walls and those wattle and daub style walls that are the iconic look for medieval buildings. But I decided to start by framing the stone walls as you would frame a real building with, what do you call these things? Studs? Wooden scaffolding? Something like that. I'm using balsa wood strips for this as I like the additional thickness, but if you can't find these sort of balsa wood strips locally or at your local Amazon.com affiliate link, you could potentially just use stir sticks for this step. You just wouldn't have the extra thickness. I guess you could glue several sticks together. As you can see, I'm using one of my D&D miniatures and also a more heroic scale Warhammer miniature here to make sure the house feels in scale. And based on this, I've decided that each floor of the house will be about 3 inches tall in height. This is a more exaggerated heroic scale, but I wanted to make sure I could use this building for a variety of different war games. So for really small figures, it'll just feel like this building has really high ceilings, and for more heroic scale figures, it'll feel more like a standard style building. But anyway, for our first few wall posts, we're going to cut pieces of balsa wood about 3 inches in height, and then glue them down to the corners with hot glue. I then added a sort of structural baseboard type piece at the bottom of each of these walls. Once again, this is just a stir stick, followed up by gluing 2 more 3-inch posts behind each of the corner wall pieces where I want the windows to be. With these in place, I then added another stir stick along the top of each of these walls to form the top of each of the walls. And as you can see here with the beams framing the windows, I've actually exaggerated them a little bit, putting them on a bit of an angle to exaggerate them a little bit, like World of Warcraft style houses. and to give them just a little bit of visual interest. With our 2 starting walls framed, I then continued adding bricks along the outside, again using hot glue for the first layer and tacky glue for each additional layer. Once I built the walls up to about a window height, again, I'm using my figures to scale here to decide where the windows should be, I added in a piece of balsa wood in the middle of each wall to form a windowsill. For the actual window frames, I tried a number of different things before landing on the following method. Basically, I just built them out of spare plastic model kit sprues that I had lying around, and depending on whether you paint and assemble plastic models like Warhammer models, this might be an extremely common supply to have lying around the house. But if you don't build plastic sprues, if you only use non-sprue models for some reason, you could always just use matchsticks or pieces of balsa wood to make these window frames. But if you do want to use sprues like I did, start by finding some lengths of sprue that are relatively straight and cut off any little stubs or extra pieces. Measure them to the size you want to fit into your window frames, and then cut them down to size to make a rectangle like this. I glued the edges together using plastic cement, but you could use whatever glue you want. I think plastic cement just gives you the strongest bond when using polystyrene like this. And once this is dry, we can create the window slat things. For this, I used stir sticks once again, but this time I cut them lengthwise to get some really thin sticks. I glued these inside of the frame using Gorilla Super Glue Gel, which is my preferred super glue. I added one first vertically and then 2 horizontally to get that generic window look. Once the glue was fully dry on these, I then placed them into the window nooks that I'd built for them, fastened them in using hot glue, and then proceeded to fill the areas around the windows with more and more bricks. As I was doing this, I also built up the entire house with more and more rows of bricks around the entire structure. And as I was doing this, I started to think about what I wanted the overall structure of the house to be. I knew I wanted this to have at least 2 floors with maybe an attic on top of that. But after all the time it took me to lay down these initial bricks, I realized I think I want the rest of the house to be built in that wattle and daub style. But this was the point when I realized also that I could just build this independently as its own ruined stone foundation for use in war games, and I could build an intact building that would sort of slide on top of this and create an intact building for when I want a non-ruined version of this building. So as I was laying down these bricks, I realized this is going to be a multi-video project. So for this first video, we're just going to make the ruined first floor of this house, and then in a future video we'll build the second floor, which will turn these ruins into a non-ruined version of the house. So with that in mind, I then focused on just getting all of the stone elements done, once again using my various models for scale, making sure the stone foundations would form lots of interesting spots for models to hide behind, take cover, and shoot their weapons from behind. With our stone walls complete, it was then time to build some stairs so that our models can actually access the interior of the building. For the front entrance, I decided to go with a stone staircase. And in order to do this, I simply built up layers of foam core, once again using models for size reference to make sure the models would actually be able to stand on these stairs. And once this foundation was built, I glued the whole thing together with hot glue. I then carved away a piece of the building where I wanted the stairs to slot into, so it would be sort of a removable piece. And I then went back and made some more bricks in a larger scale, more like stone slabs than tiny bricks. And I then proceeded to cover the stairs using these larger stone slabs to match the rest of the building, carving away parts of the stairs where necessary and just having fun with the design of it. With the staircase complete, I thought it might look cool to have a trim of these larger stone pieces around the entire building. So I then went around the entire house, adding this larger stone trim, and I think it looks pretty cool and helps add some variety to the shape of this otherwise very rectangular house. After this, there was just a few other details I wanted to add before we paint these ruins. So I added some stir stick baseboards to the home's interior, as well as a set of wooden stairs at the back entrance of the home. For the wooden stairs, I used glue on some pieces of balsa wood and made little struts that stuck out of the back of the house. And I then covered these up with stir sticks to create a kind of platform. Once this was dry, I trimmed down the edges and then built some simple stairs into the side of the house using, once again, stir sticks and hot glue. And about halfway through doing this, I realized that building all this scaffolding on the back of the building was going to make it really hard to paint the stones underneath. So I stopped what I was doing, and we'll finish the scaffolding on those stairs later. But first, we need to paint all of our stones. But of course, before we do that, I did want to add a few more details to the stonework, such as some arched patterns around the window frames. And for this, I kept it pretty simple, just the same method as most of our other stonework. I added some stones around each window frame in a sort of arched shape, trimming down the bricks into more of a wedge shape when necessary. And yeah, same method as everything else, just making little archways to help the windows stick out a little bit. And to finish each window off, I added another tiny little piece of stir stick at the bottom of each arch to form a tiny little windowsill. And with all of our stonework complete, at least for the ruined version of our first floor, it was time to paint it all. But again, before we do that, there's one more step, and that is to texture the stone. And for this, I just used a crumpled up piece of aluminum foil and gently rolled it over all the stone areas. This seems like a really subtle effect, but trust me, it's going to help us a lot once we're applying paint to make the bricks look like actual bricks. For the actual painting, we're going to keep it pretty simple. For the stones, I primed everything in the Black Magic Craft mixture of 50% Mod Podge and 50% cheap black craft paint. This is going to help seal up the foam like a sort of primer and make it much easier to paint on top of. But also the black paint mixed into the Mod Podge gives us a nice black base tone to paint other colors on top of. You'll notice as I'm doing this, I'm trying my very best to avoid getting any of this mixture on the wooden parts of the structure. We don't need any primer on those because we're just going to stain them with a wash later. So we want to try to avoid getting black paint on those. And the way I did this is I just used a big brush at first and then an increasingly smaller brush as I had to paint in the little details next to the wood. Once this was done, I gave the model about 24 hours to dry, carved any excess Mod Podge off of any of the wooden areas with a knife, and then got down to painting. And for the paint scheme, we're just using cheap craft colors. Again, you can get these at the dollar store, the craft store, for like $1 each. And I started out by just applying the same 3 colors that I used for these stone areas on my other Ravenloft builds. Starting with this dark navy blue color, applying it using a heavy overbrushing technique covering the entire model, but again, doing my best not to cover any of the wooden areas. After this, I applied a slightly lighter dry brush of this purple lavender color. And finally, this light blue cyan color, dabbing it on at first in a sponging motion and then spreading it out more like a dry brush. But after this painting was done, I realized it was a little bit too dark still and maybe a little bit too basic for this elaborate build. So I thought I might try out some techniques that I've been learning from another terrain building / battle report channel on YouTube that I've been really enjoying lately called the Dice Chatter. Link down in the description. So I'm basically copying his stone technique here. I'm just painting a lot of the bricks here in a variety of different colors that I think will look good, going a little bit brighter than I necessarily need to. But once this was done, I couldn't resist adding my own flair and adding a sort of dry brush gradient on top of these various colors, giving the whole model a sort of lavender to blue to cyan gradient. And once these were done, this was the cool part I really wanted to try out that I learned from the Dice Chatter channel. I covered all of the stonework in spackling compound, rubbing away the excess. This is the kind of stuff you use to repair drywall, and I never would have thought to use it on miniature bricks. I thought maybe the scale would look off, but I think it actually looks really cool and adds a entirely new dimension to our bricks. After giving our spackling a full 24 hours to dry, I went back in and added some washes to both paint the wood, but also to tint the grout to be less of a stark white color. And for this, I basically just used speed paint mixed with water. I know that speed paint isn't a basic supply, but you could substitute any brown paint or brown ink that you want here. Just mix it with water and create a wash. And I applied this to all of the wooden parts and then also just the entire model to tint the grout, to tint the bricks, and to just make everything look a little bit unified. And while I think this does look good, I felt it was missing some deeper shadows and areas of dirt and grimes. So I thinned down another speed paint about 1-to-1 with water. This is just a brown-black color with a slightly green tinge to it. Once again, you don't need to use speed paint here if you don't want to. And I applied this selectively to just a few areas where I wanted shadows or where I thought dirt and grime would collect. To counterbalance all of these washes, I then did an overall light dry brush with an off-white color onto every part of the model. And once this was done, I thought some of the wooden parts could use just a little bit of variety, so on all of the window frames and studs, I used a slightly darker brown color to help them stand out from the lighter panels of wood on the floorboards. Using this same dark brown color, I went over the entire model, adding even more grime and dirt in the cracks of things where I thought it might look good. By the way, you could totally stop after any one of these steps. I just got a bit carried away. At this point, I thinned down a primary green color and used this to add a few patches of moss between some of the stones just for visual variety. And as a final painting step, I used our initial cyan color that we used at the beginning to add a little final edge highlight to just a few of the bricks to help them stand out. I could probably keep going, add more things to the paint scheme, but we need to stop somewhere. So I finished up here and glued the railing onto the back of the stairs, and I painted it using the same wood colors as before. And for now, at least, I am calling this terrain piece done. And that's pretty much it. That is the first floor of our ruined stone building complete. And I promised I will make a sequel to this video where I build the next floor on the house, which will slide in and out to create a ruined and non-ruined version of this house. I'm really excited to do that. Thank you so much for watching, and I would like to extend a special thank you to all of our generous patrons. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. I really couldn't afford to do this without you. If you'd like to see your name floating by in the credits right now, gain access to bonus features, voting on future video topics, or all kinds of other extra things like our Discord server, you can do so over at patreon.com/DanaHowell. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.